Good morning. So it's 8:59, but go ahead and get started. And thanks to everybody for being here. We finished up the book of Revelation last week. Today we're just going to do sort of a one-off lesson. We're going to look at one of my favorite minor prophets, the book of Habakkuk. So if you want to be turning there in your Bibles, you can. Starting next week, Joe is going to take over the rest of the month of December. I think I'll have 4 classes maybe until the end of the year. Our baby could, come at any time. And so we finished Revelation, and so we're going to do one Habakkuk today, and then Joe will take over from there. So if you want to turn in your Bibles to Habakkuk, it's one of the 12 minor prophets. It's one of the 9, what you may hear some people use pre-exilic, which means before exile, okay? So exilic just means exile. So of the 12, 9 are before the exile and 3 are after. And Habakkuk is I think maybe the reason I like the book so much is because for a long time I had never studied the minor prophets and really had no idea what they were about. And I actually, before I came to GBN, saw a series of 12 videos that Amos Parrish's dad, Eddie Parrish, had done. And so all 12 of those are about 30 minutes long. So they're not really exhaustive, extensive studies. But I remember of all the ones I watched, I really liked Habakkuk. And so at the end of Revelation, we talked about what's the overall point of the book. And that is basically no matter what happens, if you're faithful to God, then you'll what? Yeah, you win, and you're going to end up in heaven. And we talked about how no matter what happens in your society, with the people in the first century, there was going to be a judgment brought on Rome, and some people were going to be collateral damage. Just like in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. Of course, if they were listening, then they shouldn't have been collateral damage. They should have escaped the city. But I don't really remember how that conversation led to us doing Habakkuk, but we were talking about the idea of a nation being wicked and God punishing that nation. And so that sort of brought to mind Habakkuk, so we're going to look at that this morning. So I don't know if you've ever wondered what God is up to in our world. I don't know if you're like me. Sometimes I look at the news. In the mornings, I read 2 news sources. Basically, they're complete opposite spectrums, just to see what one side thinks is important and what one side thinks is important, right? Even though I definitely disagree with what we would call the liberal media. I still read their articles, right? So I can see things on there, and it makes me think they're celebrating X or Y, and I don't understand why God hasn't wiped out the people who are teaching these things. I don't know. Have you ever thought of that? Has anybody else ever thought, why has God not judged the nation, right? That's sort of what the book of Habakkuk is about. A lot of prophets have the idea of a God speaking through a prophet, and then he goes and tells the people. Habakkuk is really a unique prophet because it's a little bit different. It's this idea of Habakkuk. He's having a conversation with God. And so we're going to take a look at that today, and hopefully that'll answer maybe your question of, okay, this is exactly what Habakkuk was thinking, 600 BC, right? So 2,600 years ago, you have somebody thinking the exact same thing about his nation. He looks at his nation and says, we are so wicked. Why is God putting up with this? Why hasn't God done anything yet, okay? So sometimes we don't have answers. We can get frustrated. We want to understand certain events, political events. Why is God allowing this? We're going to look at the same thing that Habakkuk was asking back then, okay? So who is Habakkuk? There is very little information about the author. Some people think, well, maybe he was a Levite, a temple musician, because at the end of his book, he basically, I think it's chapter 3 and verse 19, makes this reference for this to be played. Other than that, there's really no information. Some people think, you remember the Shunammite woman that Elijah, is that right? Elisha, man, I get that story mixed up. Elisha, remember the Shunammite woman that took care of him? She was an older lady, and what was her reward? She was given a what? Son. And if you remember that story, the son, basically the language in 2 Kings is like, you'll be given a son, something to embrace, someone to hold on to. And the word Habakkuk means to embrace. So there is no scriptural evidence, but traditionally, a lot of like rabbinical, Jewish rabbis, their teaching historically has been that Habakkuk was the Shunammite woman's son. Now, like I said, it's tradition. So there's really no way to prove that. And they're really just basing that off the idea that his word means embrace. And if you look up the Hebrew word for what he says to her about her son, you'll have someone to embrace. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Is that solid enough evidence to say that I think this is? I'm not going to make that statement. Some people think that it might be, but the truth is we really just don't know, okay? The date, some people, okay, let me give you some background. When did Babylon first attack and the first deportation of Jerusalem? So 606 was the first one. It gets confusing in BC because it works backwards, right? But 606 was when the first deportation, then 596, and then 586 is when he finally destroyed it, right? So you know that as we go through the book, here's a summary. Habakkuk says, God, why are our people so evil? Why haven't you judged us yet? And God says what? Oh, it's coming. Don't worry. He basically says, you wouldn't believe me even if I told you, but he's going to tell him and he will believe him. It's really a figure of speech. He's saying, I'm bringing the Chaldeans, which is who? The Babylonians, right? We'll talk about the history of who the Chaldeans were and how they became the rulers of Babylon, right? So Habakkuk says, God, our people are so evil. Look around. I see all this, immorality and violence. Why haven't you judged? And God says, well, I am going to judge you, and I'm already in the process of starting it, and I'm bringing the Chaldeans. And Habakkuk says what? Well, wait a minute. They're evil. You can't punish us with them, right? And the idea is, well, you just said that you were wicked. And so God says, look, I will use them as a tool to punish you. And then what's going to happen to them? Later, they are going to be punished. And then at the end of the book, basically you have Habakkuk in chapter 3, where he just basically has this prayer set to, it seems like a song. He's singing a prayer. It's called Shigioneth or something like that. And he's basically singing this prayer glorifying God. So it's this idea of when the book starts, he's confused, and he doesn't know what's going on, but by the end, he realizes God's in control, no matter what's going on around him. So God sort of pulls the curtain back to let him see, okay? So as far as the date goes, we know it's before 606. My guess is it's right before that, because I think 640 to like 6... Maybe I have my notes. When did Josiah reign? Okay, Josiah reigned from about 640 to 609. What kind of king was Josiah? He was a good king, okay? So if Habakkuk is saying, our people are so wicked, everywhere I look, it's immorality, why aren't you judging? And God says, well, I am bringing judgment. It's possible that it was after the reign of Josiah, like in those 3 years leading up to it when I think it was Jehoiakim was king, who was not a good king. Jeremiah talks about that, okay? So it's probably right before, a few years before the Babylonian captivity comes, okay? And so basically, let's just go ahead and get into the text. We'll work our way through it. If you have questions, just raise your hand. It's only 3 chapters long. I would like to think, well, I'm probably wasting time. We'll see how far we can get. All right, Habakkuk 1:1, okay. The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, okay? That word burden in some of the other prophets is used, basically it's talking about judgment. God's bringing judgment, okay? So look at Habakkuk 1:2. This is Habakkuk. He's speaking for the first verses 2 through 5. Or 2 through 5. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and will you not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity, verse 3, and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Okay? So what is he saying here? How would you summarize this? God, I've been what? What's he been doing? I've been praying. I've been crying out to you about all the stuff going on around me, and what happens? Nothing. Yeah, he basically says, these wicked people are acting wickedly, and they keep getting what? Rewarded. And you know what? That's not an uncommon... Can anybody think of any other place in the Old Testament? You don't have to know chapters or verses, or... Can you think of anybody else in the Old Testament that had that exact same feeling? I have a list in my notes. If you want my notes for this book, I'll give them to you. It says there the law is powerless. The New American Standard says the law is ignored, right? It doesn't mean the law doesn't have power, but it means if someone doesn't enforce the law, then what? I mean, it's meaningless, right? Okay, like, this is maybe a weird thing. I do my best to go the speed limit whenever I can, right? I'm supposed to obey the laws of the land. So I try to obey the speed limit, right? But when someone sees someone zipping by, like going 15 over, and they go right by a police officer, you know what, this is probably not, I'm always like, oh man, he's going to get him. He's going to get it. And then what happens? Nothing. Now, I don't blame him in the Memphis area. Maybe the cop doesn't want to get shot at just for trying to pull someone over for speeding, right? But whenever you have a law and people don't uphold it, what happens? It's like it's powerless, right? It's like it's never upheld, right? This is sort of a common theme in the Old Testament. In Malachi chapter 3 and verse 15, I'm summarizing, paraphrasing. It says, the wicked are raised up, they tempt God and go free. So it says, look, the wicked do whatever they want, and they even can tempt God, and nothing happens to them, right? Jeremiah 12:1 says, why does the wicked prosper? Right? Jeremiah is another prophet. Psalm chapter 73 is all about it. I'm not going to read it, but Psalm 73, David says, the wicked prosper, and then about halfway through the book, he said, but then I went to the house of the Lord, and he remembered that ultimately what happens to wickedness in the end? It always gets punished, absolutely. Judges chapter 6 and verse 13 says, if the Lord is with us, why has this all happened to us? Job 21:7, Job said this, why do the wicked live and become old, yes, become mighty in power? In Ecclesiastes 8:11 through 13, Solomon, sort of like David, said the same thing. He said something along the lines of when punishment is slow, or basically wicked people do wickedly unless they're punished quickly, right? Solomon in 12 and 13 realizes that wicked people will ultimately be punished. But is that not something we can forget sometimes? I know personally, whether it's on social media or TV, I see some people in the world that are living very filthy, wicked lives, and guess what? They're rich. They seem to have it all, right? And so Habakkuk, in a sense, sort of is asking God, Lord, I don't get this. I don't understand why these people are so wicked. I look around my nation and I see what? Evil people, and they're just prospering. It's almost like in Malachi, it says we don't understand what the point of being righteous is, because basically all these wicked people just prosper. Why shouldn't we be like them, right? So Habakkuk in these first 4 verses says, Lord, I've prayed to you. I've cried out about all this. Nothing's happening. I bet this is not the first time he's prayed this prayer. And then verse 5, something kind of cool happens. What happens in verse 5? Who answers him? God answers him, right? I think that's pretty amazing that God basically could have easily said what? I'm not going to give him an answer, right? What happened in the story of Job? Some bad situation. God allows Job to have some bad things befall him. The devil does it. God allows it. And then Job is wondering why, and finally he gets a little too big for his britches, and God says, I'm going to answer him in a whirlwind, right? And he comes down and says, who are you, X and Y and X and Y, right? But Job really doesn't get much of an answer to his why it actually happened, right? Habakkuk, this is sort of neat because Habakkuk gets an answer from God directly. So look at verse 5. This is God answering, okay? Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, even though it were told you. Verse 6. Indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. Okay? He says, look in the nations, and guess what God's already doing? He says, why aren't you judging us? God says what? I'm already working on it. In fact, I'm going to tell you something, and you're probably going to have a hard time believing it. I'm bringing the Chaldeans to judge God's people, right? Who are the Chaldeans? We know them better as the Babylonians. Who was the nation that destroyed the northern kingdom? Starts in A. Assyria, right. So Assyria, about 720, destroys the northern kingdom. Assyria is one of the world's leading powers. And then around 630, 625, you had a Nebuchadnezzar's dad, Nabopolassar, it doesn't matter. He basically threw off the yoke. He attacked and rebelled and took the city of Babylon from Assyria. Then you had this big war where Egypt came up to aid Assyria, and the Medes, who later become the Medes and the Persians that conquer Babylon, the Medes actually come and ally with Babylon, and they defeat Assyria and destroy Nineveh, which was Assyria's capital. Remember where Jonah was told to go preach, right? They destroy Nineveh in about 612, right? So the city of Babylon had been ruled by the Assyrians. But then you have these Chaldeans, Nabopolassar, and his son, Nebuchadnezzar, that take over Babylon. Okay, that's who the Chaldeans are. So you say, well, why are they called the Chaldeans and the Babylonians? Well, the Chaldeans was a people group that took over the nation of Babylon, okay? So That's who they are, okay? And so God says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation. All right, let's look up some other verses to see what kind of people the Babylonians, the Chaldeans are. Someone look up Ezekiel chapter 30 and verse 11. Ezekiel 30:11. Someone else look up Ezekiel 31:12. Someone else wants to look up 2 Kings chapter 25 and verse 7. And someone else, Jeremiah 29:22. So Ezekiel 30:11. Anybody have that one? All right, so one of the first descriptions that Ezekiel gives of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, he says, he and his people with him are the most terrible of the nations, all right? The Babylonians were bad dudes, all right? They weren't just like some weak little nation, okay? They were terrifying, okay? Who has Ezekiel 31:12? Okay, so Ezekiel 31:12, thank you for the readers, says they're the most terrible of the nations, okay? And then it talks about all the things that they've cut down, they've destroyed everything in their path, all right? Who has 2 Kings 25:7? Second Kings, go ahead.
And they slew the son of
Zedekiah.
Zebekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and behold, and bound him with fetters and brass, and carried him to Babylon.
Okay, so Zedekiah is the king of Judah. And you ever seen in a movie, right? You have someone that's like not just going to kill the guy, they're going to kill who? His whole family, right in front of his eyes, right? That's the kind of nation Babylon was. They take Zedekiah, they kill all of his sons in front of him, then they pluck out his eyes. They cut out his eyes, and then they take him as prisoner. I mean, if it was me, I'd say, just kill me. If you're going to cut my eyes out and kill my kids, just kill me. No, they do all that, then they take him as prisoner, right? Who's got Jeremiah 29:22? So the king of Babylon did what to Ahab? Roasted him, right? Like some of you may have done to a roast or a turkey on Thanksgiving, right? He cooked him. These are wicked. This is a fearful nation, right? And so Judah would not have been the first nation that they'd done these things to. Somebody that conquers Assyria was a violent nation. I've said this many times before. There's records in like ancient documents of Assyrians, when they conquer peoples, they would skin them and hang the skins on their walls, right? Like you might put a white tail on your wall, they would do that to humans they'd conquered. Right? This is when we conquered Ethiopia. That's an Ethiopian, you can imagine how wicked these people would be, right? So God says, this is who I'm bringing to destroy your people, Habakkuk, God's people, right? Verse 7, it goes on describing the Chaldeans. They're terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards. What do you think that means? They're fast, right? Okay, they're fast. This is some of that apocalyptic figurative language that we saw in the book of Revelation, okay? Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat, like an eagle that's hungry, right? These are all just these, a leopard, a wolf at night. Wolves a lot of times hunt in the evening. All these different horrible figures that are talking about these people that are coming to kill you, right, Judah? Verse 9, they all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold. The ESV says they laugh at fortresses, right? Like, okay, Jerusalem, you think you have this like big wall surrounding you. To them, what does that mean? Nothing. Here's why. They heap up earthen mounds and seize it. They say, we don't care how big your walls are. What are we going to do? We're just going to build a dirt ramp and come in and kill everybody, right? Now, if you look at Babylon, I forget how tall their city walls were. Anybody remember? It was like, I don't know, it was like 100 feet high or something. Their city walls were, they had a river that went around their city, okay, the city of Babylon. But basically they say, Jerusalem, we're not worried about your walls. We're just going to do what? Build a ramp up over it and then come in and kill everybody. And we'll starve you out before that anyway, okay? Verse 11, then his mind changes, talking about Babylon. He transgresses, he commits offense, ascribing this power to who? His god, Marduk, is who the Babylonians worshiped, right? So God says, I'm going to bring them and use them, and then they're going to do what? They're going to attribute this victory to who? Their gods. Do you remember I think his name was his name or a title, the Rabshakeh, when he came and surrounded the walls of Jerusalem, and he started speaking to people in Hebrew, and they said what? No, don't speak in Hebrew, speak in your own language. We don't want our people to hear, right? And he basically says, who do you think your God is that's going to stop us? Because we're going to do what? This is Assyria. Back up. Yeah, they're surrounding Jerusalem. And the Assyrian king says, who has stopped us? Your God's going to stop us? All these other gods have done what? Haven't stopped us, right? And so basically they were attributing, this is Assyria, they were attributing the success they had to their own God, whereas it was actually God who was allowing them, as Isaiah maybe 10 says, he used Assyria as the rod of his anger. It's the same thing with Babylon. Babylon was attributing all their victory to their own God, not Jehovah God, who was allowing them to do these things, right? Now, in verse 12, this is Habakkuk's second question, right? So he's asking God now a second question. He's kind of more confused, I think, than he was at the beginning. The summary is, God, they're wicked. How can you use these wicked people to punish us? Okay. Habakkuk 1:12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O rock, you have marked them for correction. Then he hit verse 13. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. So he says, God, you're too pure to what? Look favorably on evil people, right? So that's like the one problem. Now the second dilemma he has that goes with that, why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked person devours a person more righteous than he? So he says, you don't tolerate wickedness, but yet you're using who? A wicked nation. He said, I don't get it. Verse 14, why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook. So he's talking about now Babylon is going to take up, would be Judah. They take all of them up like a hook. They catch them in their net. They gather them in their dragnet before they rejoice and are glad. All right, so he gives you three fishing terms here, right? The first one is like a hook. The second one is like a net you would throw. And then the third one is a drag net, like one of those big dredges, right? He's basically saying how many fish are not going to be caught. I mean, pretty much almost all of them, right? You can think if you had a little pond in your backyard and you caught all you could catch with a regular fishing pole, and then you threw nets out and then you ran a dredge across your pond. How many fish are you going to catch? Almost all of them, right? And he basically says, how can you use this wicked nation to do this to Judah? The people that Habakkuk says are more righteous than these people from Babylon, okay? Verse 16, therefore they sacrifice to their net, they burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their snare is sumptuous and their food is plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? So he says, are you going to let them continue to slay us just like they're already slaying other nations? Which is what leads me to believe it's right before 606, right? They've been conquering other nations, and so now they're coming for Judah. So he basically, God, we're so wicked, why aren't you punishing us? God says, guess what? I'm bringing the Chaldeans. And then what's his response? Wait a minute. You can't use them. Well, why not, Habakkuk? Because they're more evil than we are. Okay, and then look at what God's going to give him his second response. Verse 1 of chapter 2 is the last part of Habakkuk's questioning. He says this, which I respect. I think this is, he's asking questions, but he's asking them to who? God. He's not murmuring. He's not going and complaining to all his, I can't believe God's doing this. He takes his request directly to God. And then in verse 1 of chapter 2, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart. I will watch to see what he will say to me, in this last part, and what I will answer when I am what? Corrected. It's almost like he says, okay, I know God's going to correct me, but he's still struggling, and he does what with his struggles? Takes it to God. There's nothing wrong with that. In your life, you're probably, I know I have, and I continue in the future, I know I will, there are going to be things where you don't understand why God's allowing it to happen. Why he's allowing you to have some sickness or a disease, or maybe it's cancer, or why your kid dies or your family member dies. There are things you're allowed to struggle with, but you should do what when you have those things? Take them to God, right? And trust that he's got the answers, okay? So he says to God, I'm going to watch and see what God will say. And then God answers him what? Second time. That's amazing to me, right? God is answering this man, right? God knows we're dust, and he still wants to do what? Talk with us. He's I already gave you one answer. Did God have to give him a second answer? No. No, but God, I think it's pretty neat. You look throughout Scripture how much God allows humans to barter with him, right? Remember with Abraham before Sodom and Gomorrah? That story blows my mind. That God's if I find this many righteous, I can never get the numbers right, 50 righteous. Abraham's Lord, I'm but dust and ash. How about 40? How about 35? How about 30? How about 20? How about 10? Where would you have cut off the bargaining with Abraham if you were God? All right, maybe once or twice, okay? Okay, so look at God's second answer, Habakkuk 2:2. The Lord answered and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets that he may run who reads it. If you watch GBN, you've seen the podcast Make It Plain. That's where they get their title from, is this verse here, okay? And so the idea is God says, look, I'm going to give you a vision. This is going to be the answer to your question of how I can use Babylon. And the answer is going to be, I want you to write it on tablets and put it probably in the public mark of the center of the city, like a bulletin board, right? So that everybody can see it. And then I don't know if it means so simple that someone as they're walking by can see it, where it says those who may run, or some commentators, people I've talked to, think that it means when you read this message, you're going to want to do what? Get out of Dodge, right? You're not going to want to be in Judah when this happens, okay? But I think you just basically means make it simple, put it in the middle of the city so that everybody can read it, right? It's a very simple message. They can run and tell others. That's my take on it, okay? So this is what the vision is, verse 3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, sometime in the future, okay? But it's going to happen, okay? And at the end it will speak, it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, I will not tarry. So he's saying, look, this vision might take some time to come to pass, right? But just because you don't see it happening tomorrow, what's going to happen? It's going to happen. Don't doubt it. If you wait a year or 2 years and it doesn't happen, don't think that it's not going to happen, right? If God says it, then it's going to happen, whether it's 5 years or 2,000 years, okay, in the future. Okay. Look at verse 4. Yeah.
Allowing them to repent. He's putting his sign out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's some pastors been preaching,
Mm-hmm.
but now you got the sign, and
Yeah.
you got a choice to make.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about God giving people time to repent. In Genesis, he told Abraham, basically the people of Canaan, the cup of their Amorites, I think, the cup of their iniquity isn't full yet. God was giving them time to repent. If you actually think about Babylon, Babylon rose in 625, 626 when they took over, and they were punished 539. They were only around 100 years. So were they super wicked? Yes. Did God allow them to stay for very long? No, he really didn't. But in that short time, he used them. Whereas you look at Israel, they had much more time. They had many more prophets and much more time to hear preaching and to repent. So, God was very patient with people in the Old Testament. You read about God wiping out this nation and that nation, and you think, wow, God was so harsh. People forget, well, maybe he'd been sending prophets, as we have some examples, for 600 years, right? And God gets to determine when, hey, I've been sending you prophets for 400 years, that's enough. God gets to make that call, okay? Look at verse 4. Behold, now he's going to start talking about Babylon, okay? Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith. That passage is quoted at least 3 times in the New Testament, okay? The idea is judgment will always come to people who are arrogant and wicked, okay? But the just, people who are righteous, follow God, they will live, okay? Be faithful to God and you'll live. Verse 5. Indeed, he transgresses by wine. He is a proud man. He does not stay at home. He enlarges his desire as hell, Sheol, Hades, and he is like death. He cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all peoples. He's not satisfied to just stay home. He wants to just kill and conquer and take as much land as he can and peoples. Verse 6, will not all these take up a proverb against him and a taunting riddle against him and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? How long? And to him who loads himself with many pledges. Pledges, the New American Standard says loans. I think there's some sarcasm here. Do you think Babylon was taking people's stuff and saying, hey, I'll give it back? No, I think he's basically saying you're taking what stuff is not yours, but ultimately someone else is going to take it from you, okay? Look at verse 7. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you, and you will become their booty? That's basically you'll become their treasure, okay, like a pirate. Verse 8, because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. Because of men's blood and all the violence of the land and city of all who dwell in it. It gives you 5 woes in this chapter. I think verse 6 had one, verse 9 is the second one. Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. You're taking everybody else's stuff, you're hiding it in your fortress, you think that you can't be defeated, okay? Verse 10, you give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many people, and sinning against your soul. For the stones will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it. Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity. Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts, that the peoples labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness. You are filled with shame instead of glory. You also drink, and be exposed as uncircumcised. The cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory. I don't need to explain every one of these verses. You see as we're going through that all of these are saying, it's describing who? The Babylonians and how wicked they are. Okay, so God's describing how wicked they are, and he's going to get to the point here in a few moments where he says what he's going to do to them. Okay. 17, the violence done to Lebanon will cover you, the plunder of the beasts which made them afraid, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city of all who dwell in it. What profit is the image, that its maker should carve it? The molded image, a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it to make mute idols. Verse 19, woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. So he gives all these woes. They take other people's stuff. They do violence. The last one is they're idolaters, right? It's like in Isaiah 44. He says, look, they take a tree, they cut half of it up, and they cook their food on it, and they do what to the other half? They dress it up and bow down to it and say, oh, you are my God. Right? It's like you just cooked your food on it, right? He says how foolish this is that people do that, Isaiah 44, right? And then in verse 20, but the Lord is where? He's in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So God's response to Habakkuk is that Babylon is a wicked nation who will be what? Punished for their actions. In the meantime, God can do what with them? He can use them for, guess what? Whatever he wants to, because he's who? He's God, right? God gives people free will to make choices. But when someone like Babylon chooses to do violence and wickedness, God's allowed to use their free will choices for what? His purpose, right? In his providential action, okay? Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 5 talked about how Assyria was God's rod of anger. And then 7 verses later in 10:12 of Isaiah, it says that he will punish the arrogant king of Assyria, right? Jeremiah 51 talks about God using Medo-Persia to destroy Babylon later. In fact, Jeremiah 25 says Nebuchadnezzar was, guess whose servant? God's servant, my servant. Well, how is he your servant? Because God's using him and his actions to punish people, okay? Then in chapter 3, this is Habakkuk's final response. We've got 7 minutes, okay. See if we can get through this. Habakkuk 3:1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth, right? That word, they don't have much idea what it means. It seems to be Psalm chapter 7 or Psalm 7 is the only other time I think in the Old Testament that word is used. And David sort of says it's a type of song. So it's like I don't know the right word to say it. Let me see, I have something in my notes. It's a type of song. They think it carries the idea of strong emotion, erratic wandering, wild tumult. The song was comprised as a dithram, I don't know what that word means, a vehement, impassioned poem, right? So it's a poem full of passion. And this is after Habakkuk has questioned God. God has answers. had another question, and God says, I'm going to use them to punish you because you are wicked, and then I'm going to punish them. This is Habakkuk's response. All right. Verse 2. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember what? Mercy. He says, God, I see now that you're already working on this, but whenever you do have to judge and punish, remember what? Mercy. Of course, God knows that already. It's just sort of him asking God, please don't wipe us completely out. Leave a remnant, okay? Verse 3. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah, that's like a pause. That's what that word means, mute a pause, okay? His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise, all right? If you want my notes on this, there's a whole lot more to this. I'd like to try to finish the book, so I'm just going to keep reading. All of this in the next verses is talking about all these examples in Israel's history where God did mighty and wonderful things, people he conquered, the areas that he worked and Israel saw his glory and history with Gideon and the wanderings, right? And so he's basically saying, God, we know that you did all these mighty things in the past, and you're going to do a mighty thing in the future, and so we're praising you. Okay, that's what he's talking about. Verse 4. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth. Remember in Revelation, we talked about measuring in the Old Testament is either used for protection or for what? Destruction. Yep, okay. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations. The everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan. Okay, that's Ethiopia, who was an ancient enemy. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. God defeated Midian and Judges, okay, Gideon. Verse 8. O Lord, you are displeased with the rivers, your anger against the rivers. Was your wrath against the sea that you rode on horses, your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made ready, oaths were sworn over your arrows. Pause, Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. Your bow was ready, your arrows, your horses. He's talking about what? War. God, all the times in the past where he delivered Israel through different wars, okay? Verse 10, the mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation, Joshua 10, where the sun stood still. At the light of your arrows they went, the shining of your glittering spear. You marched through the land with indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of who? Your people. You always delivered your people. For salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked, laying bare from the foundation to the neck. You always punished wicked people, and you always delivered your people when they were faithful. Verse 14, you thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses, maybe the Red Sea, I don't know, through the heap of great waters. When I heard, now I think this is him talking about now, God, when I heard what you're going to do to Judah, when I heard you were bringing Babylon, listen to what his initial response was. My body trembled, my lips quivered at the voice, rottenness entered my bones, I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. When I heard this message, what's the first thing that happened? Made him sick to his what? Stomach. He was terrified that God's bringing this wicked nation, okay? That's what he thought the first initial response was, but then look, what is his response at the end of all of this? Look at verse 17. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the field yields no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. No matter how bad it gets, right? No matter what happens to Judah, no matter how bad it is when Babylon comes, what's his concluding thought of this whole conversation with God? Verse 18. Yet I will what? Rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Even if it seems like evil is flourishing all around me, I'm going to trust who? If I have a disease or something horrible happens to me or someone in my family, I'm going to do what? Trust God. That's the takeaway for us today. Job 13:15, though he slay me, I will what? I will trust him, right? The very last verse, verse 19, the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet. Okay, that means stable, right? He will make me walk on my high hills. And then the last part says, to the chief musician with my stringed instruments. That's the verse that some people think, hey, maybe he was a Levite, all right? Either way, the overall point of this book, which that's the whole minor prophet. We just went through a whole entire book, okay? Is what? No matter how bad things get in the world around you, if you see stuff going on in the country, you think, why has God not wiped us out yet? What's the possible answer? I'm not saying this is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that's what's happening. But if America gets wicked enough, what is it possible that God might do? He could, if he wants to, use a more evil nation than us to do what? Punish us. Now, I'm not trying to say that that's where we're at, but I'm saying that ultimately God can use evil nations for his own purposes, right? So the ultimate conclusion of Habakkuk is no matter how bad the world around us gets, even if something were to happen where God were to judge America, then we ultimately should do what? One thing, trust in God, right? And that's really the whole message of the book of Habakkuk. So thanks for your time. If you want more notes, I can give you my notes. Just let me know. Thanks.